Something unthinkable is happening in Russia at 3:47 a.m. local time. The most advanced air defense system on the planet cannot see the four objects that are speeding toward Moscow at 380 kilometers per hour. They had no right to exist. Outside of Rayson, the S400 radar operator was gazing at what appeared to be a swarm of birds on his screen. However, birds don't always fly in perfect formation. Furthermore, birds do not fly directly in the direction of Russia's biggest oil refinery. The lead Beaver made a rapid ascent to 800 meters at precisely 52 kilometers from the objective and 27 kilometers from the S400 battery. It would take the missile 27 seconds to get to them. However, the drones could reach the 2 kilometers dead zone in 41 seconds with emergency power. The battery commander had only 14 seconds to determine if these were genuine threats or fakes. His way of thinking was somewhat like this. The cost of each missile was $2 million. Now, 10 seconds. However, the closure rate 7 seconds was genuine. He was instructed to wait 5 seconds for identification. However, he was fired if these were genuine. In 3 seconds, 248 and 6 DM interceptors raced out of their tubes, reaching Mach 6. However, see what the drones do. They instantly descended to 200 meters, disappearing behind the radar horizon. This is the issue. These missiles employ a technique known as semi-active radar homing. They lack a radar of their own. They require the ground station to continually apply radar energy to the target. They are blind in the absence of the light. All the commander could do was stare in horror at his screen. His missile's onboard computers only had the most recent position. Thus, they were unable to forecast where the targets would go. 80 meters above the drone's location, they exploded. 24,000 steel shards were sent into space by the 180-kilogram fragmentation weapons. Not near enough to be significant. To Panzer S-1 batteries, the refinery's last line of defense, now had just 17 seconds to engage. However, the Panzer's 1 or S-1E radar is designed for larger targets and uses the UHF and EHF frequencies. The signal return was just above background noise when compared to 0.1 square meter drones at a distance of 8 kilometers. Now it's 12 seconds. Intermittent contacts that flickered in and out were seen by the operators. 8 seconds. They attempted to slew their 2 A38M guns, but it takes 3 seconds for the hydraulic transversal to turn 180 degrees. For seconds, the lead Beaver had already located its objective by this point. At 352 minutes and 17 seconds, the warhead impacted. However, this was only the initial attack. In a row, 3 more Beavers hit 3 more targets. 140,000 tons of petroleum were used by the cascade. The entire western part reached 200 Celsius in about 90 seconds. For 72 hours, it would burn. The fuel supply to Moscow had recently been reduced by 40%, and this was just the start. 12 additional drones were getting closer to their target from 470 kilometers distant. However, the Russians believed they were prepared this time. They weren't. The Panzer S-1 batteries at Noble-Quivitz refinery had been tracking the approaching threat for 11 minutes while the drones were still hitting the prior target. 3 batteries with overlapping fields of fire are positioned in a triangle at up to 20 kilometers. Each system's singular S-20 radar could simultaneously engage for targets and track 20 targets. The commanders of the batteries had researched Ukrainian strategies. The target would never be reached by these drones, or so they believed. Something odd occurred at 4:03 a.m. 4 of the 12 drones abruptly ascended to a height of 500 meters, fully displaying themselves. Everything changed when the radar categorization system yelled a priority alarm. The radar return signatures had changed. The KH-101 cruise missiles were now matched in aspect ratio, speed, and radar frequency response. This is what actually took place. The corner reflectors, which are triangular bits of aluminum that produce what is known as retroreflection, were used by the climbing drones. When radar strikes them, the signal is amplified and bounces back at precisely 180. A 10 square meter item can produce the same radar return as a 10 centimeters reflector. Because the reflectors were made to resemble cruise missiles, the Panzer's computer saw them. The commander of the lead battery had the seconds to make a decision. He has a precise engagement protocol. Cruise missiles are always the top target. His training took over. Each of the 850-76 missiles accelerated to 300 meters per second after launching in 12 seconds. After using command guidance over the first 18 kilometers, the missiles transitioned to semi-active homing. However, there was a problem. 9G turns were being pulled by these cruise missiles, unattainable for a KH-101, which disintegrates at 3 gigaseconds. They were growing in number. 4 turned into 8, 8 turned into 16. See what's actually going on here. Reflectors were being dropped by each drone at intervals of the sea. While the previous targets slowly descended, the radar spotted new ones emerging. Aluminum foil that was less expensive than your morning coffee was being pursued by $3 million worth of missiles. However, where were the remaining 8 drones? His darkest dread was the source of the solution. 8 UJ-22s had come from the opposite direction at a height of only 50 meters. While everyone was watching the pyrotechnics from 1,500 meters, the Panzer's phase array radar is fixed, which is its fatal flaw. The entire 3,000 kilogram turret must be physically rotated in order to observe behind. But it can electrically guide the beam 45 left or right. It takes 4 to 7 seconds. The commander said, "Traverse now." It's too late. The drones were within 1-2 kilometers. After launch, the 50-76 missiles require 15 seconds to arm their proximity fuses. They would strike before arming at this distance. There are just the 2 30mm cannons left. The 2 A38M cannons start firing. 2,500 shots per minute are fired from each barrel. The lead angle was computed by the computer. That is 31 meters at a perpendicular crossing at 200 kilometers per hour. However, the UJ-22s were designed specifically for this kind of situation. They performed what is known as dynamic altitude variation every 2 seconds. Barometric altimeters are used to make random adjustments between 40 and 80 meters. Predictive targeting is used by the Panther's fire control computer to determine the target's location in 0.8 seconds when the rounds are delivered. However, prediction turns into probability when the altitude fluctuates randomly. The likelihood of a hit decreased from 83 to 31%. 7 drones survived, but one flew directly into the cannon stream and broke apart 300 meters from the head. After 3 of them located the target, the third group launched an attack. The 3 Panzer batteries were being recharged. Tubes beneath the turret housed the 50-76 missiles. Fresh missiles are refreshed, spent tubes are extracted, and the missiles are rammed into launch position by the automatic loader. 90 seconds are needed for this. Complete vulnerability for 90 seconds. 3 more direct blows were delivered to the refinery. Knowing precisely when the Russians would be helpless, the Ukrainian planners had plotted every second. However, Russia had just shifted something that the Ukrainians hadn't yet discovered at the next target. 6 UJ-26 Beavers nearing Voronezh abruptly lost their vision. At 4:18 a.m. GPS signals have vanished. Dead communications. Static was all that was displayed on navigation screens. A Krasuka for electronic warfare vehicle had just turned on. Furthermore, this was not your typical jamming. The Kashuka uses 500 watts of directed power to flood the electromagnetic spectrum between 0.1 and 18 GHz. Consider GPS signals to comprehend this. From the satellites 20,000 kilometers away, they transmitted 0.0 to 505 watts. The GPS signal is essentially 5 quintillion times weaker than the crocus jamming. It's similar to standing inside a jet engine and attempting to hear a whisper. The drones use their gyroscopes to automatically transition to inertial navigation. However, after traveling 380 kilometers for 68 minutes, these gyroscopes drift to 10. They could miss by 200 meters due to accumulated mistakes. And missing meant total failure. At this point, the drone was in full crisis mode. The processor started thermal throttling at 95 C, lowering clock speed to guard against damage. But slower processing resulted in fewer pattern matches per second. The drone started load shedding in an emergency. 2 watts are saved by turning off the navigation lights. Turn off the telemetry transmitter to save 5 watts. 3 watts are saved by turning off the radar warning receiver. It was 0 to 5 colder for every watt saved. 30 seconds to impact and 100 megahertz faster processing for every degree. No match yet. The algorithm was not working properly. Processor at 98 for 20 seconds. Thermal shut down in 10 seconds. The pattern locked after 8 seconds. Not on the actual tanks. There was no use for such shadows. However, a special geometric relationship was produced by 3 tanks. A triangle with particular angles was created by the junction of their shadows. This was still the same. Tank 7 was located with 4 meters to spare. However, one drone's computer contained the solution. Communication was impossible due to the crosses jamming, unless the lead Beaver made a desperate attempt. By transmitting on 1,000 distinct frequencies per second in a pseudo-random fashion, frequency hopping spreads the spectrum. All frequencies cannot be concurrently jammed by the crocs with the same amount of power. There was a gap on channel 847 for 1 millisecond. The drone only sent impact timing and GPS coordinates, totaling 128 bytes. Through match filtering, the piece was sent to the remaining 5 drones, who then changed their trajectory at 428 m. Tank 7 was hit first. Because of the differential thermal expansion, the warhead struck precisely where steel and concrete meet, which is the weakest spot. The pool of fuel caught fire. The crew of Pursuit 4 observed the wall of flames moving at a speed of 30 meters per second. They fled after abandoning their $20 million car. 8 additional drones showed up on radar screens when the jamming subsided. They were on their way to Russia's most strongly guarded military objective. The Russians were going to discover that the word impossible simply meant accepted in Ukrainian. The military airfield in Primorsko-Okhtyrsk was a stronghold for TOR-M to air defense vehicles spaced 5 kilometers apart in a flawless diamond formation. There were no gaps in the overlapping coverage supplied by each portion. At 8,000 meters, 2 Su-35 fighters are circling overhead. Every radar is operational. Fire control, tracking, and searched. Every Ukrainian strike had been examined by the base commander, utilizing computer modeling to position his defenses. There would undoubtedly be a shootout with 8 drones against this. However, the Russians were unaware of what the Ukrainians knew. Observe the actions of the 8 UJ-22s. They are not flying in a straight line. Fuel is wasted by the snake pattern, which is officially known as a sinusoidal trajectory variation. In a one-way mission where every drop counts, it increases flying distance by 8% and burns 43 more liters. Why? Because command guidance with anticipated intercept points is used by the TOR-M2 every weaving, necessitates recalculation. Although common filters imply consistent behavior, the fire control computer uses common filtering to represent target mobility. Process noise is introduced by random weaving. Small mistakes add up. The cumulative inaccuracy could reach 50 meters by missile launch. All for TOR-M systems fired simultaneously at precisely for 32 m using solid rocket motors that generated 4,000 kilograms of thrust. 16 9M38 missiles accelerated to Mach 2.5. 3-stage guidance was employed by the missiles. Inertial during the initial 2 seconds. Active radar for terminal homing after command guidance up to 2 kilometers from the target. A kinematic engagement box was created by their trajectories. No way out. Impact time is 10 seconds. At 850 meters per second, the missiles were getting closer. 9 seconds. Terminal guidance is turning on. 8 seconds. The seekers succeeded in reaching their objectives. Then the unthinkable occurred. The UJ-22s became vertical. They went from 180 to 200 meters in 4 seconds with a 6G pull-up, not a leisurely rise. Despite their best efforts, the missiles were unable to follow. The 9M38 employs for canards for aerodynamic control. The canards stall at the necessary climb angle of 76. The airflow separates from the control surface when it stalls. No control, no airflow. Only 12 could be compensated for by the missile's thrust vector control, except one. They sail below without incident. The infrared signature above was detected by its proximity. Fuse. The 180 exhausts of the drone at 400 C. 3,500 tungsten cubes were launched in a targeted manner when the warhead exploded. The drone turned into confetti. However, there was a reason behind that amazing interception. Every weapon, radar, and I was looking up. What was coming from the sea was invisible to everyone. After flying 700 kilometers across the Sea of Azov at a mere 5 meters above the ground, for UJ-26 Beavers arrived at the beach 15 seconds later. They had been using radar altimeters to stay above the waves for 2 hours. Although seawater reflects differently from land, the altimeters function by timing radio pulses. The ocean path meant no radar coverage, so they had to recalibrate all the time. The horizon at 5 meters is barely 8 kilometers, and ground-based radar cannot see past it. There was no defense at all for the Shahed storage hangars. 30 Shahed 136 drones were positioned in maintenance cradles inside Hangar 2. A warhead containing 40 kilograms of composition C for explosive or DX with plasticizers was carried by each Shahed. They each had 50 liters of petrol. Do the math. 1,500 L of fuel and 200 kilograms of explosives in a 40 square meter area. That equates to 30 grams of explosive per square meter, 10 times the NATO ammo storage standard. The roof of Hangar 2 was hit by the first Beaver. There was no explosion at the hangar. It took off. Before gravity took it back, it ascended to a height of 50 meters. It took 1 to 3 seconds for Hangar 3 to go. Hangar 4 came next, over to $100. Shahed, valued at $6 million, vanished in 45 seconds. The smoke from the burning drone flames obscured the runway. When the base commander ordered an emergency scramble, 150 meters of visibility. 200 meters is the minimum for the U-35 takeoff. Russia's main Shahed base was destroyed by Oktar, and yet to come was the longest shot. However, the drones would encounter an obstacle that they were unable to outmaneuver this time. To modified UJ-26 Beavers arrived in Penza, 630 kilometers within Russian territory, at 4:44 a.m. It shouldn't have been feasible. Beavers typically have a range of 350 kilometers. However, these weren't typical. It was a clever tweak. The warhead bay contains auxiliary fuel tanks. They gained 12 L of gasoline, but lost 5 kilograms of explosive, which reduced the warhead's weight from 20 to 15 kilograms. With a 30-minute reserve, that increased the range to 980 kilometers. They were unaware that an Su-35 had been hunting for 20 minutes. The pilot was not far behind. His E-radar was operating at 20 kilowatts power and narrow beam mode with a 10 scan. In order to maximize detection range against the 0 square meter drones, this produced what is known as a power aperture product that concentrates energy. At 43 meters, he had a solid track. There was nothing for the Beavers. No jammers, no flares, and no chaff. There was only one choice left. The pilots fired to her 77 missiles that they had chosen. These missiles are not your typical ones. They employ their own Argus 9 beta seekers for active radar. Homing. They are totally independent once they are released. At 18 kilometers, the pilot fired and made a 180-degree spin right away. He had completed his task. It was the missile's turn now. The R-77s used solid rocket motors to accelerate to Mach 4. In 13.2 seconds, they would travel 18 kilometers. The seekers became active at 12 kilometers, up to 12 gigaseconds. Might be tracked by each seeker. Although the drones could handle 6 Gs maximum, they were able to accomplish something that the missile could not. The barrel rolls at a range of 150 meters in altitude. The plan was to generate an angular velocity greater than the control response of the missile. The control system of the Ir-77 is updated 100 times per second. The drones were traveling at a speed of 150 degrees per second. This led to the development of the gimbal lock. Physically, the seeker was unable to spin quickly enough to keep the lock. At 80 meters, the proximity fuse of the first Ir-77 went off. The Beaver's fuselage was punctured by hundreds of 8mm tungsten balls moving at a speed of 21 meters per second. At random angles, control surfaces are locked. The engine continued to work even though half of the vertical stabilizer was missing. The second missile was successful. One Beaver was turned into aluminum confetti by direct collision, but its injured wingman stumbled forward in 40 seconds. The impact was calculated by the flight computer. If nothing is done today, the current trajectory will miss building 3 by 40 meters. Last 3 seconds. 30 meters off target is the maximum thrust pulse. 20 meters by 10 meters. Impacted for 46. At 73 meters per second, the Beaver smashed through the roof. An industrial building wouldn't be destroyed by 15 kilograms of dynamite under normal circumstances. However, the process of fabricating semiconductors is distinct. Millions of pieces of metal and concrete quickly overpowered the air filters in the clean room, which were meant to filter out particles as small as 0.3 microns. The $47 million electron beam lithography machine, which took 18 months to construct and calibrate, was destroyed. The apparatus used for ion implantation evaporated. A 6-month supply of military processors turned into silicon dust. The production of military chips in Russia was halted for at least 6 months. Russia would start the biggest air defense repositioning of the conflict in under 6 hours. There were gaps in the battlefield coverage caused by each refinery's protection system. Ukrainian HIMARS would have unrestricted access to each gap, drones costing $412. 0 were used by Ukraine to cause damage worth tens of millions of dollars. However, the true triumph was not financial. It was psychological. Drones from Ukraine might travel anywhere if they could get to Penza, which is 630 kilometers from the border. If you enjoyed this video, then subscribe to my channel, WW to Revealed, for more incredible stories and obscure historical events.